Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to DePauw University. It is my pleasure to introduce to you a gentleman who needs no introduction, the Right Honorable John Major, who, of course, will be speaking at 7:30 at Kresge Auditorium tonight. Thank you for coming. The floor is open to your questions. I will serve as moderator and try to get everybody's questions in, but without further ado, please welcome Mr. John Major. Mr. Prime Minister, first question.
Now, I think I'm going to have plenty of time this evening to say anything I wish to say in terms of statements. So if we could just deal with questions now. And I'll enter into a deal with you. You can ask any questions you like, any way you wish, and I'll answer them any way I wish. The scale of the destruction in New York and Washington was on a larger scale than any we've seen in any terrorist attack before. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is terrorism becoming more and more self-confident, and terrorism in its total sense growing. So I think the scale of this particular atrocity left no choice but the sort of reaction we've seen. Now, I think it was extremely wise of the administration and their coalition partners to wait some time before there was an immediate response, to put the assets they needed in place, and then to begin with the military response that we've now seen. And that has been relatively limited. It's been targeted at terrorist camps, at terrorist communications, and at other hard targets like that, predominantly been targeted at them. And I think that has been the right way to proceed. But I think we must all recognize we're still at the early stages of what needs to be done. I was in Washington. I was in New York on September the 9th and September the 10th. And I was in Washington on September the 11th. So I guess I shared the same sort of emotions that everyone else in this room will have shared, the sheer disbelief at the scale of it, at seeing it live in quite the way one was doing. And I spent a good deal of that day with a large number of people at a conference that was, of course, abandoned. And like everybody else, I sat there all day watching as events unfolded on television. I think it was evident the moment the second plane hit that could not have been a coincidence. Just conceivably for a few moments one might have wondered whether it was some terrible event that had occurred on a plane that had caused it to crash, but only literally for moments. I think it became clear it was a terrorist activity very speedily. Well, our country has had rather more experience of domestic terrorism than the United States. I mean, we have had a lot of domestic terrorism over the last 30 years from the Irish Republican Army. You may recall, for example, the attack on the hotel in Brighton where Margaret Thatcher and her cabinet were staying. People were killed then. I myself left that hotel only 2 hours before the bomb went off. And then a little later, I was in Downing Street, and Downing Street itself was attacked by the IRA, and the mortar landed as far away from the window in which I was chairing a meeting as you are sitting from me. And then, of course, over the last 20-odd years, we've had a lot of terrorist atrocities in the UK and in Northern Ireland. Omagh, for example, the attack on Canary Wharf, and a whole range of others. So I think we have had more mental preparedness for this over the years. We have seen it at close quarters. But I think the impact, it was very dramatic in the United Kingdom. Here, for the first time, was an attack of a ferocity and on a scale that we hadn't previously seen. And 6,000 people killed, 200 or 300 of them British. The reaction was very sharp, and I think you need not have a shred of doubt that from the first moment to the last, the British will be with the United States in this particular battle. I think there are more differences in the situation in the Gulf War and today than most people realize. In the Gulf War you had a quite specific target, a quite specific mission, and it was evident when the mission was over. That will not be the case on this occasion. So you're dealing with similar sorts of problems, but it was actually a very different sort of enterprise. As far as the press were concerned, I think in terms of the UK and the United States, the best relationship between governments, politicians and the press is one of constructive disagreement on occasions. And I think that is probably what we'll see this time too. Well, I think you have the most flexible economy in the world. And that flexibility, that capacity to move out of difficult circumstances, to adjust quickly to them and to move out of them quickly, is, I think, more evident in the United States than in any other country. So although we face a very difficult economic situation generally, I mean, here we have a problem in that the United States is going into recession. And unlike normal circumstances, it will be doing so at a time when Japan is going into recession and when most of Southeast Asia is doing so as well, and when in Europe growth is by and large pretty flat. So that's different from past recessions in the West, when you've had growth of 3 or 4% in Japan and 7% in Asia to help the world economic locomotive move. So for a limited period, we're going to have a very slow position indeed in terms of international trade. But there's not the same problem that there was on previous occasions with the oil price. That seems to be pretty static, not least, of course, because demand for oil is quite low because the economies are running at below capacity. And I think with the flexibility of the United States, there is still a very reasonable chance that this recession in the United States will be shallow, firstly, and not over lengthy, secondly. So I think some of the gloom about the United States on the basis of 2 or 3 sets of figures, I think, is being a bit overdone. Well, the sort of terrorism we were dealing with was different. I mean, there was a specific target, a specific aim of the terrorists we were dealing with. The new problem that America is facing and that the coalition partners are facing is a much wider dimension problem than the one we faced. And to a certain extent, one is having to look at events as they go along. Well, I think several things are certain. Firstly, this is a very long campaign, not just Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, but of course far beyond that. Secondly, it won't all be a military campaign. Some of it will be military, but a great deal of it will not be. It will be dealing with the financial assets of the terrorists. It will be using security and intelligence sources around the world, different countries as well, to track down where the terrorists are, to track down where the targets are. And thirdly, I think people have not yet fully appreciated the extent to which this will be a battle for people's minds and hearts, as well as simply a military battle against terrorism. The diplomats will have a great role to play in this wider conflict as it develops over the next few months. And we need to retain the support of people in the coalition, many of whom will have difficult domestic audiences. And that's going to mean a tremendous job of diplomacy for the United States and Britain and other countries, as well as the active military response to terrorism. Well, I think as far as military matters are concerned, I think that's not quite so much a matter for the United Nations. Some say so. I think not myself. The United Nations tends to operate most effectively in military matters in peacekeeping. And there may be a role in the new Afghanistan of some sort, but it is too early to say, A, whether that will be so, and B, whether it is so. It is going to be quite a delicate political and diplomatic operation to determine what the shape of a post-Taliban government in Afghanistan is going to be. It is self-evidently difficult. It's not easy to determine from outside. And I think the most that America, Britain, the United Nations can do is to bring the potential elements of such a government together so that they themselves can decide how that government will be formed and shaped. Well, the United States is the one real superpower left in the world, economically, diplomatically, militarily. And so even when the United States is seeking to consult, there is a tendency for some people to think the United States is seeking to determine and is not actually consulting genuinely, but is just ineffectively telling people what they think is the right thing to do. I don't think that is a fair criticism often. My experience of the United States is that it does often consult very widely on particular matters. And I think the coalition that was drawn together, first in the Gulf War, of course, by George Bush Sr., and secondly on this occasion by George W. Bush, has been a remarkable example of international consultation and international coalition. And I think that will need to continue. But even though it will continue, I'm sure, it won't stop some people criticizing because of the innate authority that the economic power of the United States gives them. Now, you had another one. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Well, I think you have to take each incident as a separate matter and decide what is the most appropriate way in which to deal with it. Now, I have seen the remarks and heard the remarks that have been made about Iraq. I haven't seen any of the intelligence that lies behind the assessment that is being made by the American and the British government. I've seen nothing to indicate that Iraq is involved in anything that has happened thus far. I have no means of knowing whether she is or whether she isn't. But I don't personally intend to get involved with comments about what should happen in the absence of that knowledge. I don't think it would be helpful, and I don't think it would be right. Well, it's too early to say. I mean, certainly I welcome the fact that they have started to decommission their arms. It's long overdue. It's something we've been seeking to achieve, certainly since I began the peace process 10 years ago now. And I'm glad they have done it. And I hope the disarmament we've seen is not a single one-off gesture, but is part of a continuing campaign of removing arms and the gun from Irish politics. If that is so, then no one will be more pleased than I am. I hope very much that it is so, but it's not absolutely certain that that is the case. As far as their decision is concerned, I think the decision has potentially been coming for some time. The political process has made huge progress over the last 10 years. If somebody 10 years ago had suggested we'd be in the circumstances we were even on September the 10th, before this attack, I think few people at the time would have believed it. So I think we've been moving in terms of a settlement. What I think has finally pushed the IRA into disarmament is firstly the impact of that long-term peace process. Secondly, the tremendous mess they got themselves into over their involvement in Colombia, which was widely reported over here and caused them an enormous amount of embarrassment and damage. And thirdly, I think when people saw the attack in America on the Twin Towers and on the Pentagon, I thought it brought home very vividly to people all around the world who saw those television pictures what terrorism actually means. Much more real than the abstract news that there'd been another IRA atrocity in the United Kingdom. And I think they probably, those in the IRA movement who wished to decommission, and some of them have wished to for some time, saw that as an opportunity to show that the arms struggle was no longer a credible struggle. So I think a combination of those three things, the long-term peace process, the mess they got into in Colombia, and the revulsion around the world at the sort of terrorist attack you saw on the Twin Towers, those three things in combination, I think, have driven those in the IRA who wish to disarm to prevail over those in the IRA who did not wish to disarm. I just hope it turns out to be a continuing process. Well, I think the stomach is there, most certainly. I mean, the previous questioner asked about the IRA. We've had an IRA a battle for the past 25 or 30 years. There's never been the slightest suggestion amongst the British nation that we should simply cave into the IRA, and I don't think there will be on this occasion, and I don't think there will be in the United States either. I think it will be more difficult to retain the measure of support there has been thus far. Inevitably, as months and years go on, people begin to review what the right posture is. But I think the majority of people will stay with it, and I think it would be right to stay with it, because the alternative to a continuing campaign against terrorism now is not to have one, and to see terrorism continue to grow in strength and audacity as it has done over the last 20 years or so. So I think circumstances and policy have brought us to a position where terrorism is a target that the democratic nations of the world now need to deal with. And I hope and I believe that they will have the consistency to stick with it and to carry their individual electorates with them.